It was the end of the war, back in 1945, and this Jeep is of that vintage. Back in 45, when you spoke of the war, there was no need to explain which one you were talking about. America was not only the most powerful nation in the world, it was, arguably, the most powerful nation in the history of the world. After all, we had the bomb, and nobody else did. That would change, of course, and a lot sooner than we expected, when we discovered that the Russians had their own bomb, and when we learned how they got it, the Rosenbergs. That was an espionage scandal that makes all today's stuff about the British and the Russians sending each other spies home seem pretty tame by comparison. But then we've had 40 years of competition between the West and the Soviet Union. A lot of things have changed in 40 years, but that hasn't. Our music has changed. I don't know about you, but I don't think I know the words to a single popular song today, but I probably know most of the lyrics to just about every song on this jukebox. Bogey and Bacall. They were very big back then. And if you're asking Bogey who, it's probably past your bedtime. Lucky Strike, which had gone to war in camouflage green, was back in its now familiar colors. No filters, of course. That was before filters and before we knew that cigarettes cause cancer and heart disease and emphysema. This was the time when the Soviet Union was not yet our enemy and Germany and Japan were not yet our friends. By the end of this decade, Americans would be fighting in another war. But in 1945, war was the last thing we wanted to hear about. It may be difficult for more recent generations to understand the jubilation that swept America with the news that the World War II was finally over. This picture in Life magazine captured that mood. VJ Day, an anonymous sailor kissing an equally anonymous nurse. And this is where it happened, Times Square. People poured into the streets by the thousands to celebrate the end of the war. 40 years ago this month, the war was over.
Flashed on there, the Japs have surrendered, have signed the surrender papers.
Life magazine photographer Alfred Eisenstadt was in Times Square that day.
And then I saw that sailor, and he grabbed every woman inside.
I met the girl coming across the street right here, grabbed her, put my foot before her, right down.
So what was later described as the last good war was behind us, and we came home by the shipload. More than 9 million Americans who wanted simply to get out of their uniforms and get on with their lives.
And the boys are home again, all over the world.
America demobilized to the bebop of Dizzy Gillespie. And got back to the business of courting and making up for lost time to the strains of Frank Sinatra.
The girl that I marry will have to be.
College education was free for most of these new veterans, courtesy of the GI Bill. There was a housing problem, but that problem was transformed into an opportunity by a builder named Levitt.
We believe that every family in the United States is entitled to decent shelter.
For a vet, a new Levitt house was less than $7,000, no money down. America was sick of war and the tools of war. It walked away from them. Navy ships were mothballed. Surplus aircraft destroyed. America was eager to get on with peace. The theory was that we wouldn't need all those conventional weapons anyway. After all, we had the bomb. Stuart Symington was in the War Department at the time.
The first job that I had as Assistant Secretary of War was to go around and close up the bases all over the world, which was a terrible mistake based on later developments.
Dean Rusk was also in the War Department.
Now, in retrospect, it's clear to me that we subjected Joseph Stalin to intolerable temptations through our own weakness. And it has taken us many years to pick up the pieces from that great mistake involved in our demobilization after VJ Day.
But in 1946, you have to remember, Americans still saw the Russians as a wartime ally. It was difficult to see anything the Russians might be doing in Europe as representing a threat to the United States. Our war, after all, was over, finished. It took Winston Churchill to raise the first alarm, and even then, not everyone was paying attention. It happened here, in the gymnasium at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri. Westminster was awarding Churchill an honorary degree. It was such a big occasion that President Truman accompanied Churchill on the train trip from Washington. Clark Clifford was one of Truman's young legal aides.
We played poker every evening and got to know Mr. Churchill well. He turned out to be really quite a poor poker player. So the idea after a while was carry it along and make it a pleasant occasion. I think maybe Mr. Churchill may have discussed the speech that he made with the president before we reached Fulton, Missouri, but the rest of us did not know it. It was completely new to me.
Fulton was all decked out to welcome its famous guests. There was no indication that one of the most memorable speeches of the post-war period was about to be delivered. But Churchill was such a popular hero in this country that people traveled for miles for a glimpse of him, including several people who took color home movies. Winston Churchill did not disappoint them. With one speech, Churchill began the gradual shift of America's attention toward events in Eastern Europe. With one phrase, he summed up Soviet expansionism.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe.
Churchill attacked the Soviets for endangering the peace of the world and called for an Anglo-American military alliance to halt further communist expansion. Stalin's reaction was predictable. He was furious, called the speech a declaration of war. But it would be a mistake to suggest that the Iron Curtain speech was an instant success in the United States.
And I thought Churchill was too belligerent when I read the speech in the Los Angeles Times. I wondered if he wasn't seeing dangers there that, or exaggerating a situation and seeing dangers that really weren't there. However, he proved to be right.
This was the image of communist expansionism at the time, a growing red tide directed from Moscow. That image was to remain with America for decades. Reluctantly, the United States was coming to realize that somewhere we would be drawing the line. This is where the line was drawn. Here, where the Bosporus Strait bisects Turkey into its European and Asian halves. It seemed that Soviet interests were growing at an alarming rate in the Eastern Mediterranean. They had already seized Eastern Europe, and there wasn't much America could do about that. But here, in the Eastern Mediterranean, Soviet power could and would be checked. Harry Truman would recall, after leaving office, what prompted him to draw the line, what would come to be known as the Truman Doctrine.
Let me put it this way. If you post your property with no hunting signs, you're a lot less likely to wake up some morning and find a place full of hunters who had no right to be in there.
In Greece, government supporters and Greek communist guerrillas were engaged in a ferocious civil war. There were no American or Russian troops in Greece. But on this occasion, America's no hunting signs took the form of military aid, and that made a difference to the ill-equipped Greek regular army. Jack Matathias was then a Greek soldier.
In a matter of a couple of days, everything changed in my unit. We got GMC jeeps and big trucks filled with supplies.
U.S. arms and food helped turn the war on the ground and convince Stalin to abandon the Greek communists.